This story always begins the same way. One person is left carrying questions, silence, and a strange emotional vacuum, while the other appears calm, detached, and almost untouched. From the outside, it looks like indifference. It looks like relief. It looks like someone who never cared as deeply as you did. And that perception is exactly what hurts the most. Because you're not just grieving the loss of the relationship, you're grieving the idea that it might have meant far more to you than it ever did to them. But the truth is quieter, slower, and far more complex than what you see on the surface. Avoidant personalities don't process loss the way emotionally open people do. They don't feel it immediately. They delay it. They bury it. They outrun it. And this delay creates a very specific timeline, one that almost no one talks about. But that explains everything you're witnessing right now. At the very beginning, right after separation, something clicks inside them that feels like survival. This is the breakpoint moment. It's not a conscious decision. It's an automatic emotional reflex. When connection threatens their sense of control or emotional safety, their system does one thing exceptionally well. It shuts down. So instead of falling apart, they detach. Instead of expressing pain, they go quiet. Instead of chasing, they retreat inward. To you, this looks cold, but internally, this is their nervous system hitting an emergency switch. Feeling the loss right away would overwhelm them, so their mind decides for them, not now, later, maybe never. This is why the first days after the separation feel so confusing. You're sitting in emotional rubble, while they look like they've walked away unscathed. That imbalance feels cruel, but it's not the end of the story. It's the beginning of the delay. In this initial phase, they don't feel heartbreak. They feel relief. Not relief because they didn't care, but relief because the pressure to emotionally show up is suddenly gone. The expectations are gone. The vulnerability is gone. The internal conflict between wanting connection and fearing it disappears overnight. Their system interprets this as peace. This is why they might seem lighter, calmer, even happier. They may throw themselves into work, social plans, routines, or distractions with surprising ease. And if you're watching from the outside, it can feel devastating, like you were replaceable, forgettable, or never truly valued. But what's actually happening is avoidance doing what it does best, postponing pain by creating distance from it. During this time, their mind builds a narrative to support the shutdown. They tell themselves they needed space. They tell themselves the relationship was too much. They tell themselves this was the logical choice. And because they are highly skilled at intellectualizing emotions, this story feels convincing. They analyze the relationship instead of feeling it. They reduce it to reasons and flaws and incompatibilities. This gives them a sense of certainty and control, and certainty is safety. As long as they believe they made the right decision, they don't have to sit with loss. They don't have to ask hard questions. They don't have to feel regret. This is the breakpoint moment in full effect. Emotions are not denied, just postponed. Then comes what looks like confidence but is actually a fragile window. The first week is often marked by what feels like emotional stability. This is the false relief phase. Their days feel orderly. Their sleep might even improve. They might feel productive, focused, and grounded. And again, this contrast hurts deeply for the person who is grieving openly. You may wonder how someone could move on so quickly, how someone could seem fine while you're barely holding it together. But this relief is not healing, it's anesthesia. It works temporarily, but it wears off, because no emotional bond disappears just because someone refuses to feel it. In this phase, they are not missing you yet. They are missing pressure. They are missing emotional demands. They are missing the discomfort of closeness. The quiet feels good because it doesn't require anything from them. Silence feels like space. Distance feels like safety. And safety feels like success. But this is also why the relief is unstable. It depends entirely on staying emotionally disconnected. The moment something cracks that distance, a memory, a familiar place, a habit, you start to see the shift. As the days pass, the nervous system begins to realize something important has changed. Not in words, but in sensations. The house feels quieter, the phone feels heavier, the routine feels incomplete. But instead of interpreting this as loss, their mind labels it as adjustment. They tell themselves they're just getting used to a new normal. And for a while this explanation works. They stay busy, they avoid stillness. They avoid reflection, because stillness is where feelings sneak in. This is where emotional shutdown fully activates. It's subtle and it's powerful. They don't consciously say, "I won't feel this." They simply redirect their attention every time a feeling tries to surface. Sadness becomes distraction. Longing becomes irritation. Missing you becomes numbness. This is why they may seem emotionally flat or distant when others ask how they're doing. They genuinely believe they're fine. Their system has learned that emotional suppression equals safety. And for years, sometimes decades, that strategy worked until now. Silence plays a crucial role here. For avoidant personalities, silence feels like control. Not reaching out feels like strength. Staying distant feels like winning. It reassures them that they are not dependent, not vulnerable, not exposed. And if you're practicing no contact or simply honoring your own boundaries, this silence can feel unbearable on your side. But on theirs, it temporarily reinforces the illusion that they are unaffected. That illusion doesn't last, but it's convincing enough to delay the truth. As the first week ends, the intellectual processing begins. They replay conversations in their head, but without emotion. They focus on what went wrong rather than what was shared. They remind themselves why it couldn't work. This is not cruelty, it's self-regulation. Their mind is trying to keep their heart quiet. Because once the heart speaks, control weakens. This is also when they begin to subtly monitor distance, not necessarily by reaching out, but by noticing absence. They might check social media without engaging. They might reread old messages without responding. They might think about whether you've moved on, but instead of interpreting this as longing, they frame it as curiosity. This reframing protects them from vulnerability, because admitting they care would mean admitting loss. And loss is the one emotion they've been trained to avoid. By the second week, something shifts beneath the surface. The relief fades just enough for discomfort to appear. Not sadness yet, not grief, just unease. A low-grade restlessness. The sense that something is missing but not knowing how to name it. This is when the absence starts echoing. Routines you once shared now feel oddly empty. Certain times of day feel heavier than others. Their body begins to notice what their mind is still denying. And here's the crucial truth most people never hear. Avoidant personalities don't miss people first. They miss regulation. They miss how the relationship quietly grounded them. Even while they resisted it, they miss the emotional stabilizing effect you had on their nervous system. But because they don't consciously recognize this, it shows up as irritation, boredom, or dissatisfaction with life in general. They may feel less motivated, less excited, less engaged, and they won't connect it to you yet. This is why new distractions start losing their shine. Social interactions feel shallow. Work feels mechanical. Rebounds, if they happen, feel empty. Not because you were perfect, but because emotional safety can't be replaced instantly. And this is when the mind starts to struggle. The old narrative, "I'm better off," starts feeling less convincing. But instead of questioning it, they double down. They reaffirm their decision. They convince themselves that this discomfort is temporary, that they just need more time. Internally, though, the emotional debt is accumulating. Every avoided feeling adds pressure. Every suppressed memory adds weight. And eventually the system can't hold it back forever. But that moment hasn't arrived yet. Right now they're still in control, or at least they believe they are. If you're watching this unfold from the outside, it's important to understand something vital. Their lack of visible emotion is not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their coping style. You are not forgotten. You are postponed. And postponement does not equal absence. It means the loss is waiting, quietly, patiently, for the moment they can no longer outrun it. And while they delay their grief, something else happens that often goes unnoticed. You begin to process yours. You feel it fully. You face it directly. You move through it honestly, and that difference in timing is what creates the illusion that they're ahead of you. In reality, you're just on different emotional clocks. The timeline hasn't reached the moment where they let themselves feel the loss yet, but it's coming. Because emotional bonds don't dissolve on command. They resurface when defenses weaken, and when that happens, the loss hits them all at once. Unfiltered, unresolved, and undeniable. This is only the beginning of that timeline. This is where the timeline quietly turns, even though nothing dramatic happens on the outside. No texts, no confessions, no emotional breakdowns. From the surface, it may look like nothing has changed at all. But internally, the system that once felt so calm and controlled begins to lose its balance. The relief phase has expired, and now the absence is no longer just silence, it's presence. A presence that follows them into ordinary moments. A presence they didn't invite, but can't fully escape. At first, it shows up in small, almost unnoticeable ways. They reach for their phone without thinking. They pause before doing something they used to share. A familiar song feels heavier than expected. A place they've passed 100 times suddenly pulls at their chest. These moments don't register as missing you yet. Their mind doesn't allow that language. Instead, it labels the sensation as distraction, irritation, or fatigue. But the truth is simpler and deeper. The absence is starting to echo. What once felt like freedom now feels hollow, not painful, just empty. And emptiness is much harder for an avoidant system to tolerate than conflict ever was. This is the phase where routines become reminders. The structure of their life still exists, but the emotional rhythm is off. Something feels misaligned. And because avoidant personalities are deeply uncomfortable with emotional ambiguity, they immediately try to fix it. They add more distractions, more stimulation, more busyness. They fill their calendar, their mind, their space. But no matter how much they do, the quiet keeps finding them. Late at night, early in the morning, in the pauses between tasks. And each time it does, the pressure increases just a little. Here's the important shift happening now. The nervous system begins to search for regulation. Without consciously realizing it, they start comparing how they feel now to how they felt when you were there. Not romantically at first, not emotionally, just energetically. Life feels less anchored, less steady, and instead of interpreting this as loss, they interpret it as dissatisfaction with their current environment. So they look outward for solutions. This is where the comparison phase quietly begins. New people may enter the picture, old connections may resurface, social interactions may increase, and on paper everything looks fine. But internally, something doesn't click. Conversations feel first level, emotional exchanges feel effortful. There's a subtle but persistent sense that something is missing, and they don't know what to call it, because calling it what it is would require acknowledging that you mattered in a way they weren't ready to accept. What they're actually missing isn't you as a person yet, it's the emotional regulation you provided without them realizing it. Your presence grounded them, your consistency stabilized them, your emotional availability balanced their internal tension, and now that stabilizer is gone, their system feels off-kilter. But because they were never taught to identify or articulate this kind of emotional dependency, it shows up as restlessness rather than longing. This is why rebounds or distractions often fail to satisfy during this phase. They can replicate excitement but not safety, novelty but not grounding, and avoidance systems crave grounding more than they admit. They just don't want to depend on it. So when new connections feel exciting but unfulfilling, confusion sets in. They don't understand why nothing feels quite right. And instead of turning inward, they keep searching outward. As this continues, another layer begins to unravel. Identity disruption. Relationships don't just connect people. They reinforce identity. Who they were with you subtly shaped how they saw themselves. The version of them that existed in that dynamic had a role, a rhythm, a reflection, and now that reflection is gone. At first, this feels like independence, but over time, it starts to feel like disorientation. They may question themselves without knowing why. They may feel less confident in their choices, less certain of their direction. And because avoidant personalities often anchor their sense of self in autonomy and control, this uncertainty is deeply unsettling. They don't connect it to loss yet. They tell themselves they're just in a transition phase. But transitions require emotional processing, and that's exactly what they're avoiding. This is when the body starts speaking more clearly. The mind can suppress emotions for a long time, but the body keeps score. Sleep becomes lighter or more restless. Anxiety shows up without a clear trigger. There's a constant low-level tension they can't seem to shake. They may feel drained even when they haven't done much. These symptoms don't feel emotional to them, they feel physical, and that makes them harder to ignore, but also harder to understand. The body remembers connection even when the mind denies it. It remembers safety. It remembers closeness, and now it notices the absence. This is why the loss begins to surface somatically before it becomes conscious. Tightness in the chest, a heaviness in the stomach, a sense of being on edge. These sensations don't come with a story yet, but they carry meaning. During this phase, they may start thinking about you more often, but still not in a way that feels emotional to them. Thoughts come and go unexpectedly. A memory pops up uninvited. A shared joke resurfaces. A detail they once overlooked suddenly feels significant, and instead of sitting with these thoughts, they push them away. They distract themselves. They minimize them, because letting those thoughts linger would open the door to feelings they've been avoiding since the beginning. This is also where the internal contradiction intensifies. Part of them still believes distancing was the right move. Another part is beginning to feel the cost of that distance. And because avoidance systems struggle with holding emotional complexity, this contradiction creates stress. They don't want to revisit the decision, but they don't feel settled in it either. Externally, you may notice subtle changes if you're paying attention. They may seem less certain, less energized, less present, but they won't express it. They won't reach out. They won't admit confusion. Because admitting confusion feels like weakness, and weakness threatens the very defenses that have kept them emotionally safe for so long. This is where the loss is no longer fully avoidable, but it's still not conscious. Grief. It's pressure without release, tension without tears, longing without language. And that is an exhausting place to live. The emotional dam hasn't broken yet, but cracks are forming. What makes this phase especially painful for the person who loved them is the silence. You may feel forgotten, replaced, erased, but the truth is far more paradoxical. You're not absent from their internal world. You're unresolved within it, and unresolved emotions don't disappear, they accumulate. While this is happening for them, something different is happening for you. You are processing openly. You are feeling fully. You are integrating the loss into your identity rather than resisting it. And that difference matters because while they delay, you move forward. And the distance between your emotional timelines continues to grow. The loss they are avoiding now will eventually demand attention. Not gently, not gradually, but all at once. And when it does, it won't feel like nostalgia. It will feel like impact. This is the middle of the timeline, the quiet before the emotional reckoning, and it's far from over. This is the point where avoidance starts to fail. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in quiet, leaking ways that can no longer be fully controlled. The strategies that once worked, distraction, logic, distance, begin to lose their effectiveness. The emotional pressure that has been building underneath finally finds small exits, and when it does, it surprises them more than anyone else. This phase often begins with moments they can't explain, a sudden wave of heaviness while doing something ordinary, a feeling of sadness that appears without a clear reason and disappears just as quickly. A pause in the middle of a busy day where everything feels strangely empty. These moments don't last long, but they are unsettling because they break the illusion of emotional mastery. For the first time since the separation, something slips through that doesn't fit their narrative of control. They may try to ignore it at first, tell themselves they're tired, stressed, burned out, anything but emotionally affected. But the leaks continue. The more they resist, the more frequently these moments appear. And this is where something important happens. The loss begins to move from the body into awareness, not fully, not clearly, but enough to disrupt the emotional numbness they've been relying on. This is often when memories resurface with unexpected force, not just surface-level recollections, but sensory ones. The sound of your voice, the way you laughed, the feeling of being understood without having to explain. These memories don't come with dramatic sadness yet. They come with a strange ache, a quiet recognition that something meaningful existed there. And for someone who has spent their life minimizing emotional dependence, that recognition is deeply destabilizing. This is the emotional leak point. The moment when the heart starts speaking despite the mind's objections. They don't want to listen, they don't feel ready, but the message keeps repeating something real was lost. And pretending otherwise is becoming exhausting. Around this time, their internal certainty begins to erode. The decision that once felt so clear now feels questionable. Not wrong, just less solid. Doubt creeps in, but it doesn't announce itself loudly. It whispers. It shows up as what-if thoughts they quickly shut down. What if they overreacted? What if they misinterpreted things? What if they ran instead of stayed? These thoughts don't stay long, but the fact that they appear at all is significant. This is often followed by a quiet realization that feels both obvious and terrifying. Maybe the loss wasn't insignificant. Maybe it wasn't mutual indifference. Maybe it mattered more than they allowed themselves to believe. This realization doesn't feel like heartbreak yet. It feels like vulnerability. And vulnerability is the one emotional state they've spent years protecting themselves from. As this awareness grows, so does the fear. Fear of regret, fear of accountability, fear of having misjudged something important, and most of all, fear of emotional exposure. Because once they admit the loss to themselves, the next question becomes unavoidable. What now? This is why, even when the realization hits, they still don't reach out. Not yet. The awareness comes before the courage. And in avoidant systems, that gap can be long and painful. They sit with the discomfort quietly, telling themselves it's too late, or that reaching out would only complicate things, or that they don't even know what they would say. These rationalizations aren't lies, they're shields. Shields against the possibility of rejection and against the shame of needing something they once pushed away. Then comes nostalgia, but not the soft, sentimental kind. This nostalgia is selective and sharp. They remember moments they once dismissed, details they overlooked, efforts you made that they didn't fully appreciate at the time. The emotional safety you provided becomes clearer in hindsight, precisely because it's gone, and this clarity hurts in a way they weren't prepared for. What makes this phase particularly intense is the internal conflict it creates. On one side is control, the familiar protective stance of emotional distance. On the other side is connection, the risky, unfamiliar territory of emotional truth. They feel pulled in both directions at once, and because avoidant personalities struggle with integration, this conflict feels overwhelming. They may oscillate during this time, one day feeling detached and resolved, the next feeling heavy and unsettled, One moment convinced they made the right choice, the next quietly wondering if they lost something irreplaceable. This inconsistency isn't manipulation, it's internal chaos. They are confronting emotions they've never learned how to hold without panicking. This is also when silence starts to feel less empowering and more isolating. The quiet that once felt peaceful now feels loud, too loud. And yet, breaking it feels dangerous. Reaching out would mean admitting vulnerability. It would mean risking rejection. It would mean facing the possibility that you've already moved on, or worse, that you're healing without them. This is the moment when control and connection collide. They want to preserve their emotional autonomy, but they also want relief from the growing ache. And the more they resist choosing, the more intense the discomfort becomes. This is the internal war no one sees. Time continues to pass. 2 months, sometimes 3, and now the grief that was delayed finally demands space. This is the late grief phase. And unlike immediate heartbreak, this grief arrives without support, without permission, and without preparation. There's no one checking in, no one expecting sadness, no one validating the pain, and that makes it heavier. This grief doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like emptiness. Sometimes it looks like regret that circles endlessly without resolution. Sometimes it looks like emotional withdrawal from everyone, not just you, because once the loss becomes conscious, their system doesn't know how to process it constructively. They were never taught how. They may replay the past repeatedly now, not to justify their decision, but to understand it. They look for turning points, missed opportunities, moments where things could have gone differently, and each replay adds another layer of emotional weight. This is when they finally feel the loss in full. But by now, it's compounded by time, silence, and unresolved feelings. What's painful about this phase is that it often happens when you are already on the other side of your own grief. You've cried, you've questioned, you've healed pieces of yourself, and just as you're finding stability, they are entering the emotional storm you survived months ago. This mismatch in timing creates one of the most misunderstood dynamics in these connections. They may never tell you any of this. They may never articulate the regret. They may never reach out. But internally, the loss is no longer avoidable. It sits with them. It reshapes how they see past and future connections, and it teaches them something they resisted learning for a long time. Avoiding pain doesn't prevent it, it delays it. If you're listening to this and wondering whether the loss ever reaches them, the answer is yes. But it reaches them in their own time, through their own defenses, and often in their own silence. And while they struggle internally, something else becomes clear on your side. You didn't lose because you felt deeply. You didn't lose because you cared. You didn't lose because you stayed open. The pain you felt early was not weakness. It was honesty, and honesty heals faster than avoidance ever will. This phase marks the turning point of the timeline, the moment where the loss is no longer theoretical. It's real, it's felt, and it's irreversible. Only one final chapter remains. Now, the loss begins to speak in full volume, even if no one else sees it. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It creeps into ordinary moments, sharp and undeniable. Avoidants finally encounter what they've been postponing. The reality that someone who mattered is gone, and their own emotional strategies cannot rewrite it. This is when the emotional reckoning begins. At first it appears in subtle ways. A sudden pang of longing when a memory surfaces, a quiet ache while completing a task you once shared. They feel restless during mundane activities, as if a part of life is missing. It's confusing because nothing in their rational mind demands sadness, yet the body knows something is absent. The weight of absence presses down. Their system, trained for avoidance, struggles to process it. Its emotions have been delayed for weeks or months, sometimes longer. This is when regret quietly sets in. not dramatic regret, but the persistent, gnawing kind that lingers behind the scenes. They begin replaying moments they dismissed. The laughter, the intimacy, the subtle ways they were cared for, they suddenly appear in stark contrast to the quiet that now fills their life. It's a comparison they cannot escape. And unlike their previous reflections, these are not analytical. They carry emotional charge. Each memory is a reminder of what they let slip, of the security and warmth they deny themselves. During this phase, the inner conflict is intense. On one hand, there is a desire to regain connection. On the other, there is fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of rejection, fear of confronting emotions they have spent so long avoiding. Their system oscillates between craving what was lost and resisting the risk of needing it. This internal tug-of-war is exhausting, destabilizing, and invisible to those on the outside. It is also the moment when avoidance starts to lose its power. They may begin to realize that no distraction, no new routine, no surface-level relationship can replace what was lost. External stimulation cannot substitute for emotional safety and familiarity. And this realization is unsettling because it exposes the cost of avoidance, the loss of something real, meaningful, and irreplaceable. Now comes the phase of silent grief. It often looks ordinary to an observer. They might appear composed, functional, even busy, but internally they are navigating waves of emotion they cannot yet articulate. There may be tears that come and go in private, sleepless nights, and a sense of emptiness that nothing can fill. The grief is compounded by frustration. They see clearly the loss but have no immediate way to act or express it without compromising the protective identity they've built. In this late grief phase, longing is mixed with shame. They begin to ask themselves why they ran, why they avoided, why they were unable to hold connection when it was available. These questions are uncomfortable because they challenge the core defenses they have relied on for so long. For someone who equates vulnerability with weakness, these self-inquiries are terrifying, yet unavoidable. The loss now demands acknowledgement, and avoidance alone cannot contain it. This is where emotional complexity surfaces. They start to experience multiple feelings simultaneously: regret for the past, anxiety about the present, fear of rejection, and a lingering sense of what might have been. Each sensation competes for attention, creating internal chaos. And because they have avoided processing feelings all along, the emotional volume feels overwhelming. It can manifest physically as tension, headaches, fatigue, or subtle anxiety that doesn't have a clear trigger. By this point, their mind is no longer fully in control of the narrative. Logic and rationalization fail to suppress the weight of emotion. The previously tidy timeline of avoidance has fractured. Memories, longing, and emotional discomfort demand presence, and the avoidant can no longer postpone engagement with them. The internal experience is vivid, uncomfortable, and unrelenting. And yet, even now, outward expression may be minimal. They might not reach out. They might continue to maintain distance. But internally, the loss has transformed into undeniable truth. They recognize, without words, the depth of what they have experienced and what they have lost. They feel the absence of connection, of intimacy, and of someone who mattered. And that realization reshapes the internal landscape completely. At this point, the avoidance emotional reckoning is often cyclical. Waves of grief and longing emerge unpredictably. One day they may feel quiet ache, the next day subtle nostalgia, then sudden remorse. These emotions are not linear. They fluctuate, contradict, and sometimes feel unmanageable. Yet this is the point where emotional integration begins. Though it is slow and often silent, they are finally processing the loss they postponed for so long. There is also a quiet mental acknowledgement. The relationship held meaning, and their actions contributed to its ending. This recognition may never be vocalized, but it reshapes their internal story. The avoidant begins to understand that avoidance delayed loss. It did not prevent it. Emotional honesty, though painful, cannot be postponed indefinitely. Finally, they may experience profound regret without the words to express it. This is not a manipulative tactic, it is the unavoidable truth of human attachment and emotional processing. Love, connection, and loss are forces that avoidance cannot erase. They have delayed the emotional impact, but they cannot erase the truth. Someone they cared about deeply is gone, and their absence has reshaped their emotional world forever. Through this timeline, there is a lesson for those left behind. While the avoidant may eventually feel the depth of the loss, their process is delayed, fraught, and often silent. Meanwhile, you have already faced, processed, and survived the grief. You have felt fully, healed authentically, and reclaimed your power. And this contrast is not a reflection of imbalance. It is the natural timing of emotional processing for different attachment styles. By the end of this journey, the avoidant has confronted what they resisted: absence, longing, regret, and the undeniable truth that the connection mattered. It may arrive months later, years later, or even in quiet reflection, long after separation. But the timeline is consistent. Initial detachment, false relief, emotional suppression, subtle awareness, comparison, identity disruption, bodily cues, leaks of emotion, selective nostalgia, and finally, unavoidable grief and acknowledgement. And as they navigate this late phase, the truth remains. The relationship's value was never diminished by avoidance. The love you shared existed fully, regardless of whether it was immediately recognized. Their delayed grief is a testament to the strength of their defenses, not a measure of your worth. And while their reckoning unfolds quietly and internally, your journey has already demonstrated the power of emotional courage, resilience, and presence. In the final analysis, the timeline reveals a profound insight. Avoidance can delay grief, but it cannot erase it. Emotional truth will surface, regret will emerge, loss will be felt, and those who stayed open, honest, and present will move forward, empowered, witnessing the inevitability of what avoidance cannot contain, the deep, undeniable reality of love and loss. This is the complete journey, the exact timeline, and the emotional architecture behind when avoidants finally let themselves feel the loss. It is intricate, delayed, and deeply human, and understanding it allows those left behind to see their own healing, not as waiting for them, but as thriving while they navigate the echoes of what was once postponed.